the listening tools and the state of listening. And I would like for you to maybe help us get acclimated to what the state of listening looks like today.
That's a big question, Brian. Well, you know, I have been doing this. I've been looking at listening tools, social media monitoring tools, analytics, pretty much everything that's involved in trying to understand what's going on in the social web. And the short answer is it's a huge mess. It's a huge mess. Is this on?
It's on, but closer.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Closer.
That's much better. It's a huge mess. And it's a huge mess not because the tools aren't good, because many of the tools are phenomenal. It's a huge mess because the business processes and the understanding of what to do with that listening is incredibly nascent. And so, you know, what I'm seeing a lot right now is that there are context issues. In other words, what signal to me may be noise to you. There are time issues. There are issues of place, issues of department, issues of business strategy, all of which influence what you end up doing with that information. And so what's missing to me in this environment today is some kind of architecture for what to do with business listening. And right now, it's focused on marketing. It's starting to move out to support, but it's still very, very early days.
All right, and this question is for you, Jody, and then Tim, I'd love for you to sort of complete the thought. With this rise of social media, I guess a lot of this really depends on where it starts within the organization. We've seen it start within marketing, we've seen it start within customer service, we've seen it start within communications, and it lives in that particular department for the time being. I guess a couple of questions. One is, where do you think, Jody, it belongs? And where do you see it evolving or touching Tim over time?
So, just to take a step back, what we're seeing is that the world is evolving from a social graph to an interest graph.
Wait, that's a question I have. Don't get too far ahead. I'm just kidding. Please continue.
And the reason this is important is because you're asking me a question in the context of business. You know, where are people engaging in business? And I think it all started with fans and friends. And that was hard for business to get their hands around because a few years ago they didn't have many fans and friends. And what we've done over the last few years is we've helped businesses build the audience, but we really think that consumers are now moving to a place where they're not waking up on Sunday morning and wanting to see the camping shots of all their friends. What they're waking up on Sunday morning is they're thinking about Super Bowl or a brand that they want to go shopping for, or something that's much more to do with their day-to-day life. And they want to see what their friends are saying, but more importantly, they want to see what people with authority and people who have a lot of conversations around that topic are saying. And that's much more encompassed in an interest graph. So we're saying to businesses that this has become a major new channel for them, and they need to be focusing on actually providing that interest graph information to consumers. And what's very exciting for me is that, and I say this to my kids, what turns me on is that this is the first time, I think, in human history that we have something that is actually catalyzing our generous side. And our generous side is about sharing. And like when we connect computers in a network, the network is more intelligent. When we connect people with social networking, then the overall network becomes more intelligent. So what we say to business is, hey guys, this is all about interest graph, and Google told people to search, and now we're going to teach them to build interest graphs.
So maybe a little contrarian here, and maybe address a little bit your question, which was who should be paying attention. And I would say, first off, everyone should be paying attention, not the marketing department, not some monitoring group. You know, the essence of what was fresh and empowering about internet conversations was that they really were conversations. And you know, the theses that were laid out in the Clear Trade Manifesto are as real today in the era of all these professional tools for monitoring people's interests as they were back in the beginning. Great companies have every person listening. And you know, there's a great example of this, and I was talking with someone who'd been at Amazon, And I like the way she framed how they thought about empowering the employees in customer service. She said, we imagined, what would Jeff do if he were listening to this customer service call? And so they empowered the customer service people, to say, whoa, this is a bad problem. We're going to pull this product. For example, the person gave the example of a table always arrives scratched. So they go, okay, the ordinary customer service person can do what Jeff would do and go, sounds like there's something wrong here. This thing always arrives damaged. It's always screwed up. We've got to pull it until we figure it out. And I love that attitude of empowering everybody in the organization to act as if they were the CEO. Now, obviously, in so much of corporate America, that is not the case. Where we have, the guys at the top who are so isolated. And they talk about glass ceiling. Forget the glass ceiling. These guys are in a glass bubble. And, we really have to break that bubble. And we need to get the voices of customers touching everybody in the organization. So what I find exciting about these tools is that they're available for everyone to be a better listener.
Well said. How many people in the room are familiar with the term interest graph?
Well, you just heard Jody say you're all familiar with it now.
I guess the Jedi mind trick did not work. But to help out, basically, how many are familiar with the social graph? All right, good, better. All right, so the social graph are the individuals we're connected to within any given network or across multiple networks, right? The interest graph, or the setting of this conversation, are within those networks or outside of those networks, the individuals that you're connected to based on shared interest. And depending on that interest, you will find that those networks, if you were to visualize them, look different with some overlap, but they're quite distinct. So that way, for the rest of the conversation, it might make a little bit more sense.
Can I just add to that, Brian?
Please.
If we said we wanted to build an interest graph around O'Reilly, what we would do is we'd find the last 100,000 mentions of O'Reilly, and then we would look through that list, work out all the names of the people who were in that list, and we'd say, who has the most number of friends who's talking about O'Reilly? That then becomes the O'Reilly interest graph, because we end up with a list of people who actually are related to the champion at the top of that list that's talking about O'Reilly. And that then can be done by community or location. And that becomes then very interesting.
All right, so Susan, because you have been studying all of these tools, I could only imagine that it's difficult not to let the culture or the behavior behind these tools touch you. And maybe it won't show up in your report. But I would like to know if you think that, based on what Jody and what Tim is saying, if you think that the tools and the processes and the systems around using these tools within the organization are actually getting in the way of the information touching the rest of the business.
Yeah, I would state it a little differently, Brian. I think there are very few tools and there are very few processes to get the right information to the right people. So the executives who are stuck in a bubble, in a glass bubble, are stuck there because there are very few people within organizations who can take that scratch table story and actually roll that up, aggregate that in such a way that people can start to see the trends, right? So what happens is that typically you have people listening in organizations who listen for certain things. Very frequently they're agencies, very frequently they're marketing departments. So what they typically do, because it's human nature, is they listen to reinforce the campaigns and the programs they've already rolled out. That's very helpful for them. It is not helpful for the rest of the business, and it's not helpful for the customer.
All right, so let's start to take a little bit of what listening is and maybe talk a little bit about what it should be, right? Because I'm pretty sure that if we were all to compare notes in terms of our listening templates, they would pretty much look the same. We'd have mentions, we'd have sort of mentions against competitors for that share of voice. We might even have a sophisticated process where we're looking at the share of conversation, where we're looking at the greater market of discussions. We might even get fancy and sort of throw a little sentiment in there. But a lot of this has to do with intelligence, because
you left out the interest graph. Because I think that what Jody intuited, and that I think is a really important thing about People Browser, is the mapping from topics to people. And I think that's the really different thing here. It's not just sort of listening to all of these conversations and saying, oh, I'm tracking this topic. It's I'm tracking this topic and I'm identifying and clustering and finding how to build a relationship with the people who also care about that topic.
Well, you're exactly right, Tim.
Thank you.
But the point was, first, that we're still at the basics. And this is from listening to collective intelligence. And you're exactly right, and I promise we're going to get there, and that's where we're going to climax. That sounded very sexual, sorry. DJ, can we get a little Marvin Gaye?
I heard it through the grapevine. Ooh.
Jody, we actually go back to almost the beginning of People Browser, and we've learned quite a lot together. Where do you go from now, by the way? I'm working on it. Transitions. Could you share a couple of stories? Because I know them, but I'd love the audience to hear a little bit about when you've come in to intelligence for organizations, what kinds of scenarios have you found where you share insights that the brand was surprised to hear about their consumer?
Okay, well, I'm not going to give you any names.
No need.
Come on.
Actually, I have to say that I'm quite relieved that I'm no longer being challenged about whether Twitter is a fad or not. I have to tell
Definitely
you.
a fad.
What's that?
Definitely a fad.
Yeah, definitely a fad. Definitely not the fad. Even a year ago in New York, I was doing a big brand presentation, and I had to spend 10 minutes convincing executives a year ago that Twitter was not a fad. Anyway, it seems that everyone has swallowed on it now. The thing that I think that we see most is that the brands have no idea where they sit relative to their competition with sentiment. And they also have no idea that there's such extraordinary volume. We're seeing now about 2 million brand mentions a day, just on Twitter. And we're seeing that generally about 1% is bad for a brand on average, and about 70% is good. I mean, the good news is that most people actually prefer to say really nice things. So, you know, that's one big thing, I guess, is they don't quite understand their relative position. And we had a meeting just last week with a big Silicon Valley brand, and we showed how their product rated against their competitors. And I spent 15 minutes explaining to them that yes, we had actually caught every tweet, because they could not believe that they were almost 50 to 1, and they were the one and their competitor was 50, being outspoken. And as Tim was saying before, what we do is we cut that data up by community so we can show them. And what was really interesting, we did an interest graph for Pepsi. And we found that it was, who would guess which community is speaking most about Pepsi? Any guesses? The musicians. The musicians were speaking most about Pepsi, which was unusual. And then the other thing that we do too is we look to see what are the conversations about. I did a presentation to a brand about mummy bloggers. And if anyone can guess what mummy bloggers speak about most, I will give you $20. What was that? No. One more.
Coffee.
No, one more. It's so good you guys didn't get it. I kept my money. No. No,
People Browser.
People Browser, no. Mummy bloggers talk most about saving money, and then secondly about love. Now, how cool is that?
Is it?
Hopefully not in the same sentence. Well, Jody, you also...
Buy me love.
Stay there. Jody, one of the other stories that I love that you've told in the past, I won't mention any brands, of course, is the idea of...
Other than Pepsi.
The idea of intelligence in the fact that they had been spending all of their dollars in terms of marketing and creating this perception of the ideal user of this particular brand, only to find that everybody talking about it and loving it was the complete opposite.
Actually, that was a fun study that we did. We did a study on really high action sports for a brand, because they said that was their market. And we found that all of the people who were following the brand were the antithesis of high action people. They were the people who wanted to be mountain climbers, but they were generally not the high action people. And that was pretty cool because it's, you know, in marketing, so often we find that what we try to do, the opposite turns out to be.
All right, Tim, Susan, this one's for you. We're talking about letting information touch other aspects of the organization. And quite honestly, information, I think, is the ultimate battering ram that's going to break through these walls of the silo. We have departments in some more sophisticated organizations today that, you know, BI, business intelligence. The social media is sort of outside those walls. Let's talk a little bit about whether or not business intelligence should start to extend what it is looking at, or if this is going to become one of those outside-in types of things where it's going to have to be brought up through marketing or through service or what have you. You know, kind of playing off the whole idea of analysis paralysis, where there's almost this fear of too much information.
Well, I have very complex thoughts about business intelligence. I think there's a fundamental shift going on in the world in which business intelligence is moving away from the old model in which people study reports, even kind of reports that you could build with something like People Browser, and then make decisions, to one in which you use analytic tools to build algorithms so that your organization responds automatically and does the right thing. And, you know, that's sort of the cutting edge. But, you know, I think that, you know, we need to, as organizations, be moving more towards autonomic responses to what we see and hear. And that's kind of, you know, further out along the curve, I know, for many people. But it's really, we're going to have to get beyond BI. You know, the example I use of this is, you know, Google, who's really on the cutting edge still, despite not being quite the, you know, the darling of the valley that they once were. You know, when you think about how they do search quality, for example, it's not like somebody's sitting there going, ooh, that's a lousy search result, let's push this one up. They say, ooh, that's a lousy search result. How do we have to tweak the algorithm so it doesn't show up anymore? And that kind of thinking is really going to penetrate even, I think, into social media. You know, sort of like we're going to actually be modifying what we do so that we get different results, rather than you know, kind of studying it and responding on a one-by-one basis.
So if I could add to that, Brian, I think that what Google and Microsoft Bing are doing at the moment is completely upside down when it comes to social search. This is not about taking PageRank search and then mixing some tweets in, which is what we're seeing at the moment. This, where I think the consumer wants this to go, and in a few years, I hope it's in this place, you post a search query and you see first what your friends are saying, then what people in your community are saying, then what people in San Francisco are saying, and then maybe you mix some PageRank in amongst down near the bottom. And so I think that where search is going is completely the reverse of what we're actually seeing now on Google. And I mean, it's a big call, but I think they've taught us to search, and now we're learning about friends, location, interest graphs, and community, and search is going to be turned upside down over the next few years.
Yeah, I have sort of a heretical view on this, which is that I think the social graph and the interest graph will converge. And here's an example. I was on a panel this morning with 3 women from Moxie, Polyvore, and ModCloth talking about fashion and social. And Polyvore is this community of women who basically become fashion editors in their own right. They go to the Polyvore site, it's an e-commerce site, they look at, you know, items of clothing, accessories, etc., and they create their own fashion editorial, they create their own looks. And then people start to follow them. So, you know, I don't know about you, but when I go shopping, I love my friends, but I don't necessarily rely on them for style advice. Some more than others, right? You know, and I revere Robert Scoble, but I wouldn't necessarily ask him, like, do these pants look good on me and stuff? So the Polyvore model is really interesting because you have this community of affinity, right? It is an interest graph. But the woman from Polyvore this morning told this fantastic story about how these women now are starting to connect with each other on the site and actually go to fashion week together. And so what's happened is that the interest graph has become a social graph. And this is also true with the mommy bloggers, by the way. I'm a recovering mommy blogger myself, who, you know, who connect with each other around conditions, around issues around child raising and things like that, and then in some very real cases become friends. And so I think, you know, when we look at it in a binary way, either interest or social, we're kind of missing what happens contextually in that process, and you know, it gets very complicated there, and I don't know, you know, I'm not an algorithm person, so I don't know how that's going to work, but I do see it kind
By
of.
the way, great post by Fred Wilson recently about, actually there was another one by John Battelle too, I'm kind of interested too, really this idea of sort of meta services, because really you want tools that would let you, you know, look at your social graph in each of these services and say, oh yeah, I follow these people here for this, and I follow these people over here for that, and I follow these people over here for that. Right now, we don't really have good tools for managing across services, and I think that is the next way of coming.
It's one of the promises actually for Facebook groups, right? Because I think sociologists will say that in real life you have 4 to 6, maybe as many as 10 distinct networks with very little overlap. So how we network today is not at all how we network in the real
That's
life.
right. Just for a little bit of historical perspective, Aristotle said that it's only possible to have one friend.
That's quite a deny.
How many people have seen that episode of South Park where that individual only has one friend? Very wonderful story.
I just want to comment on something that Susan said about the social graph, interest graph. I don't think it's a matter of social graph or interest graph. I think that there's no doubt that we're going to end up with an interest graph that contains our friends' data. But more importantly, the focus is going to shift to what interests us today. I think that's the key. And friends will be part of it, as will strangers, and we'll be able to authenticate strangers. I think that has, you know, that's the gold standard. How do we authenticate strangers? The reason that we go to friends first is we know who they are. But for the interest graph to gain momentum, we need to be able to rapidly authenticate people whose tweets we don't know.
But I'll also say that you know, one thing that makes us call someone a friend is that we have some overlapping interests, such that when they tell us, "Hey, this is cool," we're likely to agree. And you know, somebody who is not a friend might say, "Oh, this is cool," and you go, "Oh God, they've got to be kidding."
So we only like people who agree with us.
No, it's not agree with us. I think it's actually, it's the ideal friend has a degree of difference such that you see things you would never have seen or come across yourself. They extend you.
And add value to our ideas.
That's right.
Or they
Somebody's
completely
here in the audience looking good.
All right, just a couple more questions, then we're going to open it up to you folks. All right, so Tim, Jody, Susan, I'm sure you've all seen in your research and just even through day-to-day experience, and quite honestly, businesses are run quite from a very efficient operationalization standpoint, where this type of data really starts to threaten how even the very nature of businesses work on a daily basis. And Tim, you brought up something earlier, and Jody, which you continued on, is this idea of authority as well as algorithms. How do you see businesses sort of scaling the amount of information that comes into the organization? Jody, you had mentioned something as many as 2 million brand mentions a day. We've heard a little bit of this social customer hierarchy, where maybe businesses will only pay attention to those individuals who have a iPhone next to their mic. Where those individuals have maybe pay attention to those who have a higher clout score than others because of the propensity or the likelihood for that individual to make waves.
So clout, is that some kind of cleanser?
They've got the stain out there.
It's an attention cleanser.
So, where I think
I feel dirty afterwards.
where I